Welcome, everyone. My name is Lone Denker Visborg. I'm Ambassador of Denmark to the United States. And thank you all for joining us here today for this webinar on the Nordic Model for Competitive Economies. What is in it for the US? At today's event, we hope to discuss lessons that might be drawn from the Nordic countries for building resiliency in a post-COVID economy. The Nordic region, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, are high-performing market economies founded on liberal market principles. Together, they add up to a population of about 26 million. They are highly globalized, export-oriented economies that are open to trade and successful in innovation and startups and in attracting investments from the USA and beyond. The Nordic countries have fostered advanced industry and world-class companies that sustain a solid foundation for high living standards. They're also known for their work ethic and high labor market participation, and a society dedicated to work-life balance. This gives the Nordic populations the freedom to pursue their dreams and goals. The Nordic capitalism has soft edges, as we say. The foundation for growth and prosperity goes hand in hand with principles of equality, of social cohesion, and concern for the environment. Indeed, these values give our countries a competitive edge, as we will be hearing more about during our conversation here today. The cornerstone of the Nordic social models are widespread allocation of wealth, free education, free healthcare, and a system that helps unemployed workers find new work or obtain appropriate retraining. Another element is the close cooperation between public authorities and the private sector. Furthermore, the Nordic countries are strongly committed to working together within the region and with international partners, for example, on combating the consequences of climate change through innovation. Skills and basic education has for a long time been a key domestic priority in the Nordic countries. And college education is funded by the taxpayer throughout the Nordic region. Consequently, the region has one of the most highly educated populations in the world. Gender equality plays a big part in the success of the Nordic countries. The proportion of women working is among the highest, and men take paternity leave. To give an example, Sweden became the first country in the world to replace maternity leave with gender-neutral parental leave in 1974, and in 1995 introduced the first Daddy Month, requiring each parent to take at least some leave on a use it or lose it basis. Today, men use on average 30% of the 480 days of leave provided to parents. Finally, the Nordic countries rate at the very top of international rankings on trust, on freedom of speech, as well as happiness in general. As you can hear, the Nordic countries are multifaceted. Still, we're surely not perfect. For example, in all Nordic countries, women still perform most of the unpaid care work, and on average, women earn less than men. But our experiences prove that promoting a more gender equal economy through inclusive work policies is not only the right thing to do, it's an economic imperative that benefits all of society. With this short introduction to what the Nordic region is all about, I'm excited for the webinar to get started. The webinar is a collective effort of the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Nordic Center of UC-Berkeley, and the embassies of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. I'm thrilled to give a warm welcome to our moderator, Robert Strand, professor at UC-Berkeley and founder of the Nordic Center of UC-Berkeley. I'm looking very much forward to an interesting discussion, and Robert, I hereby give the floor to you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, and welcome everyone. The Nordic Model for Competitive Economies. What's in it for the US? That is the topic for today, and I am Robert Strand. I have the great privilege to be the executive director of the very new Nordic Center at UC-Berkeley. And I have a few titles of which I'm proud, and Mr. Nordic is one of them. that the wonderful Barbara Osher bestowed upon me, who is the honorary consulate general in the Swedish consulate in San Francisco. And I'll say the one I'm the most proud of is that of parent to these two wonderful little guys. Behind these are self-portraits. That's my Mikkel on the left and Jonas on the right. And my role as a parent really informs me in considerations of the topics at hand for today, of course. The Nordic countries are known for their significant investments in human capital, including workforce development, paid family leave, and the social safety net. What do these countries tell us about how to foster a workforce that is able to skill up and adapt, and how to ensure that workplaces better fit and benefit women, men, and families? How do we make workplaces work for people and not the other way around? I think the Nordics may have something of interest to offer us here. So this is the topic for discussion today. Now, I'll just say briefly, my American mind was revolutionized by my experiences in the Nordic countries. I had the privilege first to go to Norway as a Fulbright scholar many years ago and studied across the Nordic countries, and then pursue my PhD in Copenhagen, where I stayed on as a professor. I'm currently working on the book, and I will soon finish it, called Sustainable Vikings: What the Nordics Can Teach Us About Reimagining American Capitalism. And I can say that from experience teaching classes, in which I've now had the privilege to lead over 1,000 Americans on study tours of the Nordic countries, I can see I'm not alone. I'm not alone in having my American mind constructively provoked by my experiences in the Nordic countries. And so I'd like to start today introducing you with a few students that I've had the privilege to lead on study tours of the Nordic countries over these many years. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know I look remarkably young, but I've been doing this for a long time. So if I could, we'd like to start, and we'll show you a couple of excerpts from some offerings from some students, American students that had opportunities in the Nordic countries over these past few years. If we could start that video, please.
My name is Sarah Leinberger, and I traveled to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden as part of my MBA program at the University of Minnesota in 2008. I took an ethics course called Corporate Responsibility, a Scandinavian approach that was taught by Robert Strand. It was a life-changing experience for me in many ways. It was the first time I was introduced to concepts such as the triple bottom line and saw a truly different way of doing business, particularly the investment in human capital. As someone who's grown up in Fortune 500 companies since undergrad, I was inspired by the what-ifs presented to me in that course and the ideas that have stuck with me throughout my career, especially as I've grown into broader leadership roles where the decisions about what is right and what is good for the long term become tougher and tougher at each level. I'm greatly inspired by what is working in the Nordic countries and hope we as a connected global community can learn from one another as we continue to face the uncertainty of tomorrow. Here, as we look at our post-pandemic economy and workforce, it is impossible not to wonder if there is a different or better way to do things. I'm so energized that this work is being done in this space and the fact that such an honorable cause is being brought forth for our collective tomorrow. Thank you.
Good day. My name is Sarah Peterson Post. I'm a VP of Product Management at a gig-based delivery service and a 2010 MBA alum of the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management. More than a decade ago, I had the opportunity to be immersed into Nordic culture, both business and life, through an ethics seminar led by Dr. Robert Strand. Now, in the last 10 years since I graduated from my master's, I've noticed and been a part of the evolution of business from more bottom line driven to more purpose driven. In this purpose-driven approach, we're forced as companies to think about the values, the behaviors, and the systems that we need to put in place in order to strive to get closer and closer to our purpose. Now, we must do that same thing as a country. What are the values, the behaviors, the systems that we need to put in place in order to thrive as a society? And I think that notion of personal responsibility and long-term thinking is part and parcel to that. Another key element that I took from this seminar from the Nordic culture that I'd be remiss to not call out is shared parental duties and how the countries support parental leave, both men and women, and the notion that two supportive caregivers is better than one. My friends and I during this time spent a couple of free days in the beautiful city of Uppsala, Sweden. During that time, we noticed how many men were pushing buggies around more than a decade ago. It was enough for us to think it was weird, to call it out to each other, something that we hadn't seen in our city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where we live. We later learned, of course, that those Nordic countries, and we were in Sweden, have the best parental leave out there in all of the world. Since that time, I think many American corporations have granted that afford to can grant parental leave, mine included, both men and women, which is critical for them to achieve gender equality in their workforce. It's not just women that are having off-ramps and on-ramps and off-ramps and on-ramps, that men are too. Now, the businesses that get left behind in this are not corporations. They're small businesses right now that cannot afford to have both men and women granted parental leave. Or if they are, it's a very short period of time for the men or for fathers to take off, and certainly adoptive parents as well. So this is something that we can learn from the Nordic cultures and see what's working for them. How is it shaping their societies? And how can we emulate programs like that?
Good day, everyone. My name is Eric Alborg, and I work at Cigna, a large health services company in the United States. I had the pleasure of visiting Copenhagen and the surrounding areas of Denmark in 2018 as part of an international immersion program through the University of California, Berkeley Haas School of Business in 2018. My last name is Alborg, so I thought I knew quite a bit about Denmark going into the experience, but it was my first visit and I realized how little I actually knew until I started to study and then get into the immersion part of visiting businesses and other organizations there during our visit. The first thing is that Denmark is home to many companies that we know about very well in the United States. Companies like Lego, Novo Nordisk, who was one of the founders of diabetes, chronic condition medications, insulin, Carlsberg, a large beer manufacturer, and many others. Maersk is just another one that we visited as well, a large shipping company. But what struck me about these companies was not just that they were household names that I didn't know about before visiting, but that they took a unique perspective and commitment to the way they did business. And most of that difference from the way I was used to doing business was the stakeholder approach. They didn't just look at shareholders and try to maximize returns. They certainly do need profits to continue to do their business, but they took diverse perspectives when they made business decisions, which I thought was a very sustainable way of doing business, a very long-term perspective way of doing business. The other thing that I was incredibly impressed by was the way in which they approach their societal commitments, meaning that, for example, childcare is something that allows everybody to pursue how to develop themselves for their future, and that is something that everyone takes very seriously there. So my experience was an incredible one. I can't wait to go back, and thank you for allowing me to share a little bit about my experience in Denmark.
All right, everyone, welcome back. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce, frankly, an all-star panel here. And I, as an American, I don't have to go by the rules of Janteloven. I can say this is an all-star panel that we have. And I'd like to introduce, starting with you, Ben, please. Ben Geddes is the Associate Director for Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a Washington, D.C. think tank. Mr. Geddes is the former Director of Labor Market Policy at the American Action Forum. He's extensively researched and written about U.S. policy on paid family leave, labor force participation, and the social safety net. I now move to Dr. Caitlin Collins, who's an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And I can't tell you how proud we are. She's a good friend of the University of California, Berkeley, and presented on Nordic parental leaves just before the pandemic in one of the best events I've been part of at UC-Berkeley. Dr. Collins was a visiting researcher at the Linnaeus Center on Social Policy and Family Dynamics in Europe at Stockholm University, Sweden, and has published the book, Making Motherhood Work: How Women Manage Careers and Caregiving, an in-depth study of middle-class working mothers in Sweden, Germany, Italy, and the United States. And I can vouch it's an excellent offering. Dr. Collins, so wonderful to have you with us today. And I move then to Dr. Haldor Bjørkeflot, professor at the University in Oslo, Norway, and visiting professor at the Center for Civil Center Studies at the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark, where I was given a PhD. That's, Haldor, they say, you should question a club that lets you in it. And Copenhagen Business School gave me a PhD. So I have some questions about the Copenhagen Business School. And but he's extensively, Dr. Bjørkeflot's extensively published about Nordic countries and is one of 4 editors behind a new book, The Making and Circulation of Nordic Models. And Haldor, I do not yet have that book, but I can't wait to get my hands on it. Haldor, we're going to start with you, if you would, before we move into a panel discussion. Haldor is kind enough to offer an overview as our resident Nordic citizen and expert here about this thing, the Nordic model. What is this? Haldor, if you please take some time here to kind of set the stage for us so we have an understanding of the Nordic model. Please.
Thank you, Robert. If you are the Nordic of Berkeley, I'm the Nordic in the Nordics. We have been having a strategic initiative at the University of Oslo that I have been in charge of. And also we have a Nordic hub called Renew, who is organizing conferences. Our book is part of a long work, of a 3 or 4 year work where we have collected data on how the Nordic model circulates. And this book is in open access, so you all can read it. What we have observed is that the Nordic model has increased its circulation around globally since the early 1900s, 2010s, excuse me. So it's been a very positive development for the Nordic model. We are on top on nation rankings on dimensions like happiness, trust, quality of living, and ease of doing business. So both the World Economic Forum and the UK-based journal The Economist have showcased the Nordics as supermodels for the future. Well, that's a bit too much for us, even. Many economists have praised the Nordic model for its ability to combine equality and efficiency. And also the famous scholar Francis Fukuyama talks about getting to Denmark. It's a route for that poor nations ought to take. Well, all such reports about the Nordic success, of course, may be balanced by other less rosy accounts. But I guess my task here is not to tell you about all the problems we have in the Nordic countries. So I will move on to say a bit about what is the Nordic model. First, the Nordics are open, small, export-oriented economies. This means that we depend a lot of incomes from export, much more than the US, for instance. Secondly, the Nordics represent a culture of compromise and regulated conflict. The current collective bargaining and welfare provision arrangements have a history back to the early 1900s. Both political parties, unions, as well as employers have had to make compromises and pacts, agreeing to respect each other's interests. The role of states is to keep distance in support of a decentralized model of wage formation and worker and employers' rights. There is no minimum wage because it is left to the employers and unions to negotiate wage levels. Thirdly, these negotiated export-oriented economies have created a compressed wage structure. Earnings among lower skilled and higher skilled jobs have not differed to the same degree as in the US, for instance. Lower skilled jobs are paid better than in the US. Higher skilled jobs are paid relatively less. The high cost of unskilled labor has provided employers with incentives to introduce more efficient work methods and new technologies. In general, the Nordics work less hours in a year than do workers in the US. Fourthly, there is a long history of active labor market policies and so-called flexicurity. The idea behind these kinds of policies is that employers may restructure industries, while the state provides support for the workers, enabling them to move from one kind of job to the other without losing their income. Without an active welfare policy aiming at supporting workers in case of unemployment, parenthood, and sickness, such restructuring would not be possible. Another dimension associated with the Nordic model is trust. Surveys show that the Nordics score much higher than other countries, particularly the Eastern countries, but also Southern countries in Europe, when asked, do you trust other people in general? And do you have trust in institutions like the politicians, media, and other active partners? The high trust level is referred to as the Nordic gold because it makes it easier to make policy decisions. But even more importantly, it makes it possible to implement such decisions. In general, people trust that they get something back from the taxes they pay. And this makes it much easier to redistribute some of the wealth created in society and invest in infrastructure. So the last point, you also have to explain this trust. And it really relates to the quality of government, according to recent research, show that and also this is linked to the universal provision of welfare, because we talk about a universal welfare state. By this, we mean that all members of society, whether rich or poor, have a right to the same kind of welfare services. The idea behind this policy is that if everyone gets something back for their taxes, this will increase trust in society. So that's how we explain the high trust level. So, as we will talk more about here, and as also the ambassador has mentioned, recently there has been a movement towards talking more about sustainable economic and welfare system. How do we sustain this? And actually, family policy is a very important part of this new development. Early education and gender equality has become increasingly important elements of the Nordic model. Investment in childcare and parental leave makes it possible for women to participate at the same level as men in the labor market. Also, it makes it easier to integrate immigrants and their children in society. The higher the labor market participation, the more growth in the economy. My role here has been to outline some of the experiences from the Nordic region. I will now leave it to the other panel participants to reflect over whether these experiences have any relevance to the United States.
Halldor, thank you very much. There's a lot that you offer there that we can pick up on. Ben, I'd like to move to you if I could here, and this idea that Holder offered of flex security, and that is, a security achieved for individuals and an overall society through flexibility. And that's flexible labor markets, that's continuous workforce development, and these sorts of things. I know that this speaks to issues that are near and dear to your heart. Would you please kindly reflect upon this, and in an American context, and considering and help express to us, what do you think? What do you see? What do we need in the United States with respect to workforce policy?
Thanks, Robert, and thanks for doing this event with us and having me as a part of it. I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. So I think for me, what I've studied a lot in the last year or so is the challenges that America is now facing in getting workers to return to the labor force and recover from this pandemic. And we're looking at ways of, as a country, to build more resiliency into our workforce. And in the pandemic, the experience from that pandemic for the United States, I think there are two things that to me jump out as lessons that we can pull from the Nordic countries, and that's paid family leave and workforce development. So when it comes to paid family leave, over the past year, caregiving has been a significant barrier to work for many people. And this has been something that obviously predates the crisis and has been more pronounced during the crisis. So at BPC, we've done some polling and found that the equivalent about 10 million people stopped working during the pandemic, at least in part due to caregiving. And of that group, 3.4 to 4.6 million left the labor force altogether. They stopped looking for work. And then caregiving also didn't just lead to people stopping working. It also led them to reducing their work hours. We found another 11 million people reduced how much they're working because of caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic. And as childcare centers closed, schools went to remote learning, and then also a number of other illness-related caregiving responsibilities that occurred over the last year and a half to 2 years. And so we also took a look at, what could be the role of paid family leave in helping people get back to work and helping them continue to work. And in the United States, we do not have a guaranteed paid family leave benefit. It's largely left to the private sector. And as a result, about 23% of workers in the United States have access to a defined paid parental leave benefit. So what we found was that during the pandemic, 71% of people who did have paid family leave said that it helped them continue to work. And that included 86% of parents with children under 12. We also found that among those who are unemployed, over a third say they would be more likely to go back to work if their next employer offered paid family leave. So that speaks to workers really who are out on the sidelines are continuing to have trouble balancing work and caregiving. Now, this is not all to say that I think the U.S. should adopt exactly what the Nordic countries have when it comes to paid parental leave. Research shows that parental leave longer than a year, 6 months to a year, can have negative impacts on the workforce. But a 8 to 12 week parental leave benefit would really provide a lot of help in getting workers back to labor force. And because what happens is when you have paid parental leave, rather than leaving a job altogether, when you do have caregiving responsibilities, you get to save that job, take the time you need to care for a loved one, and then go back to work. And so that's on parental leave. The other thing I'll touch on briefly before we turn it over to Caitlin is Nordic countries are very good at workforce development. And that's something the United States also struggles with. Workforce development in the United States is not well integrated into our unemployment insurance system. And it's also all the actors in it are very siloed. The educators, the businesses, and the government do not communicate well. And as a result, there's skills mismatches between what educators are providing and what employers need. And so when you look at the Nordic countries, on the other hand, it's a very integrated system. It's a much more proactive system, providing alternative career paths where, unlike in the United States, you're not as reliant on getting a college degree in order to access high-paying, high-growth careers. And those are the types of policies that the United States would really benefit from, and not only helping people go back to work, but also providing additional support for income growth and mobility.
Fantastic. Sounds like one of us is about to be arrested. If you see me running out the door here, you'll know it's because the cops finally found me. Thank you very much for that, Ben. And I'd like to just take a moment to say I'm seeing some questions coming in from the audience, and thank you. Please keep the questions coming in the chat. We'll do our best to draw a few out here. But I want to take this opportunity to turn to Caitlin. And you recently wrote a fantastic piece that ran in Harvard Business Review, and the title of it is just excellent. The free market has failed U.S. working parents. I like when I can get a good sense for the article with the title, and I certainly can there. And Caitlin, I also just want to highlight in your book, and I would encourage everyone to pick up a copy, Making Motherhood Work. The titles of your chapters are so succinct and offer a comparative here. And I just want to share two of those chapter titles and then turn it over to you for some reflections and offerings as you see the world. And your chapter 2 is about Sweden. And the quote that you draw from an interviewee is, "It is easy in Sweden to work and have kids." And chapter 6 is about the United States. And there the title is, "We can't figure out how to do it all at the same time." Could you please offer some reflections and your perspectives here, Caitlin, with respect to these topics?
Thank you, Robert. Sure. And thank you for the kind invitation to join you all today. So this book, Making Motherhood Work, was motivated by the reality that the United States has the most family hostile public policy of any country in the Western industrialized world, right? The United States has no cohesive national family policy. We have no paid parental leave at the federal level, no universal child care, no universal health care, no universal social insurance entitlement, for example. And so the challenges of working parents today, I would argue, sort of reached a crisis point, and then the pandemic happened. So if we talk about working parents' experiences as a crisis before a global pandemic unfolded, we can understand the plight of parents today as even more critical than it was beforehand. And so my interest in doing this project and interviewing working mothers in Sweden, Germany, Italy, and the US was to get a sense for how women navigate employment and motherhood with countries that have very different policies on the books, but also different cultural attitudes about women and men and work and family. And the truth is, one question I'm asked often is, okay, so where do working mothers have it best? And it was very obvious in my study, without a doubt, that those working mothers lived in Sweden. Sweden tops every chart for example, for gender equality, right? As we've already pointed out, they have led many international scales when it comes to the quality of early childhood education and care. As we heard from Haldor, right, there's a very high rate of labor force participation among women, including those who are mothers, right? And so in the US context, the sorts of challenges that working parents, both men and women alike, face mean that it is almost impossible for them to figure out how to combine caregiving and employment at the same time. They adopt individual level solutions to try and navigate this conflict, whereas countries like Sweden and others in the Nordics have adopted more universal solutions, right, at the national level to help parents and all of those who have caregiving responsibilities, those who are caring for the elderly, for example, combine employment and caregiving in a way that feels quite natural for them. And that's why Swedish moms laughed when I asked them the question, for example, do you think you can be a successful mother and a successful worker at the same time in Sweden? And they'd be like, well, yes, of course you can. The whole society is structured to make that happen, right? And in fact, Swedish moms even laughed when I used the phrase working mother during our conversations. I would say, talk to me about your experience as a working mother in Sweden. And they kind of looked at me funny or giggled, and I'd ask why, and they say, we don't actually even have a phrase in Swedish for working mother like you do in the US. One woman told me, what else would you be? I'm an adult, I work, and I have children. That's what's expected of me, and that's what I do, right? And so this assumption that most adults will combine employment and caregiving is embedded in Sweden's policy, right? And of course, in many of these other Nordic countries, they intertwine their family policy, their labor policy, and their gender equality policy in a way that has, of course, wonderful outcomes for women, but also their children, their families, and their national economies. So I think the US, as Ben has just pointed out, can learn a lot of lessons from these Nordic countries and apply them to the US, which in many ways is a different context. But I think we can adapt some of these best practices for the model here in ways that would be beneficial, again, for women, men, families, kids, and also our economy.
Caitlin, thank you so much for those offerings. And a phrase that I heard you use throughout there is this idea of universalism. Everyone has access. And this is something that, Holdor, I'm going to come back to you here in a moment on here because you stress that as well. And I've become fascinated by former Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme and reading some of his old speeches from the 70s. And he visited here in the Bay Area a number of times there. It happened to be at Stanford, that other university. But still, the speeches are incredible. And he emphasizes this notion of universalism. Everyone has access, doesn't matter, poor, rich, middle. Holdor, you were stressing that these are universal offerings. Could you please expand upon that and why is that? Why it is universalism? Why is that so important for these policies?
First, can you hear me? My picture is frozen, but you can hear me?
We can hear you just fine, and your face is moving as well, so you're good.
Okay, it's only on my computer then. Well, universal welfare policies is important because they create some kind of safety in the whole society. If you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you start out with the physical needs, food and water and housing and so on. But the next level is actually safety and insurance against if something happens to you during life. For instance, if you get a child or if you lose your job and so on. So, of course, this is what the historically both the social democratic parties and also the liberal parties have been struggling for. They say, as a worker, you should not stand with your hat in the hand and serve someone, either being the municipality, the social services, or the employer. You should be independent, and in order to be independent, you need to have some security in life. So that's when you can start talking about freedom to act and so on. So this has been very important for historically, and as you say, Olof Palme and many of the previous leaders have been. So this has been the idea behind the universal welfare state, and research shows, as I mentioned, that it's the high trust level is related very much to the efficiency and the output from the welfare system. So that's how we think about these things. That's why it's important not to have according to how your specific needs are, but in the general needs in societies, so everyone feels included.
And Holdor, thank you for that, because the notion of efficiency is so important here. And I sometimes think that maybe that's part of a barrier that we have in the United States, is an assumption, whether right or wrong, but that anything that has any sort of potential state involvement inherently has to be more inefficient than what individuals would do on their own. And when we look at things like the taxes are higher in the Nordic countries without question, but then when look at polling as far as are Nordic citizens happy with what they're getting for their taxes, the responses are remarkably high, 90+%. In Sweden, the equivalent of the IRS is the most trusted and well-liked government agency. And you just, as an American, you almost just, it doesn't make sense. Ben, I'd be interested from your standpoint here, where you could see some of insofar as we're talking about some programs that sound very reasonable, paid parental leaves and workforce development that are the norm in the Nordic countries. What are some barriers that as you see it here in the United States, that we would have to overcome, whether it be perceptions or whether it be realities, in order to implement something that works better for us Americans?
Thanks, Robert. Well, I do think that efficiencies in government is a problem for the United States. And we saw that on full display during the pandemic and still today. And often what happens, the federal government in the United States, we provide these big benefits, some of which are universally available, and to those who when they do fall on hard times. But what happens is that we don't put enough investment in the administration of those benefits. So one good example of this is unemployment insurance. During the pandemic, when cases started rising and people started losing their jobs en masse, we saw unemployment insurance systems completely unable to handle the influx in claims. Systems shut down. They were operating on technology that was decades, half a century old, a coding language. And so people ended up waiting weeks, if not months, to receive their unemployment benefits at a time when we're asking people to stay home, not necessarily go back and look for work because we had all these social distancing orders. The other big example of where there's been quite a bit of inefficiency during the pandemic is with housing assistance. At a time when the federal housing eviction moratoria was being lifted, we had billions and billions of dollars in housing assistance that was was devoted by federal law, but our federal institutions weren't able to process them in a timely way and get them to the people who need them most. And so this is an issue that crops up time and time again in the United States, and something that will be important for should the United States adopt the paid family leave legislation, to make sure that it's rolled out appropriately and it has the appropriate administrative structure so that people don't have to wait too long. They don't run into too many hurdles when they access the benefit, because when somebody goes and tries to get a benefit and for whatever reason they're denied, or when they should be approved, or they just takes them too long to get the benefit, that erodes trust in that program. And that makes it much more difficult for those programs to last politically.
And Ben, what I hear in here also is just this, and I've experienced it firsthand in the Nordic countries, is it feels as if I see innovations in government in the Nordic countries. I see high in efficiencies. I see things like doing my taxes in Denmark. It's done for me and I can opt out. It's there. And this centralized system that also then can efficiently get benefits to where the government happens to say, we want to get benefits here for COVID relief, for example. That was just done like that in Denmark as an example. And I sometimes wonder if we in the United States, in the 20th century pounding of the government is always the problem. I mean, that's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, it seems. And it seems like maybe we've taken an important tool from a society out of our toolbox. Caitlin, I'd be interested to hear your reflections, because, and particularly this Harvard Business Review piece, "The Free Market Has Failed U.S. Working Parents." You're kind of taking this on straight on and saying maybe free market solutions in every single case don't work. And perhaps to draw from the economist Arthur Olkin, who said, a capitalistic society, the market needs its place, and the market needs to be kept in its place. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as far as how might we overcome? What are some things, insofar as there are lessons from Sweden that we feel are important to draw in the United States? How do we overcome these barriers to implementing things that are actually in our own interest?
Thanks, Robert. So I think paid parental leave is a straightforward example we might use here, right? So if we leave the provision of paid parental leave up to the market, what this means, unfortunately, in the US context, is that more highly educated, wealthier workers have greater access to these policies than less advantaged workers who have lower levels of education. These are disproportionately folks of color in the United States, and they're actually the ones who most need access to these policies, right? Because they have fewer resources. And unfortunately, if we turn to or rely on the market to provide these policies, many private employers do offer paid parental leave policies in the US, which is lovely for those employed at these places, right? I think that's wonderful. They often work as recruitment and retention tactics, typically at white collar workplaces, right? But unfortunately, what happens is this creates a disparity between workers who work for places that offer these sorts of policies and those who also really need them but don't work for those sorts of employers, right? And so I think that there's polling shows there's very high levels of consensus that paid parental leave is something we need in the United States, right? We are the only Western industrialized country in the world without it. We're one of just a few countries on the planet without it. And we already have examples here in the United States, such as the state of California, that has shown when folks have been polled now after a decade after their paid parental leave policy rolled out at the state level, that employers reported either neutral or positive effects on worker productivity, on profitability, on turnover, and morale, right? So there was not these disastrous consequences for offering paid family leave in the state of California. And we've, of course, seen that across the Nordic countries, that this is a benefit that actually helps people retain their commitment to the labor force, their attachment, right? And often, as Ben pointed out, unfortunately, in the United States, parents, and especially mothers, tend to drop out of the paid labor force after they have a child, and absent any sort of universal childcare system to help care for children before they go to school, right? Our public school system, starting at the ages of 5 or 6, is really the country's largest childcare infrastructure. But that suggests that it's up to parents to figure it out on their own for the first 5 or 6 years of a child's life. And the Nordic countries are in consensus that this is an incredibly important time in children's lives for them to be cared for in a healthy and safe and pedagogically rich environment, right? So paid family leave and the provision of high quality subsidized childcare work together to help support parents who have children so that they have quality time with them to bond and recover from childbirth or adoption and then go back to work, right? So these sorts of policies, there's universal consensus, they're the norm. They're also considered a right in the Nordic countries, right? Women and men there don't tell me, for example, when I interview them, that they feel so lucky to have access to paid parental leave. They're like, well, of course I have access to paid parental leave. This is a right of mine by virtue of being a resident here. Whereas in the US, when I interview folks, because so few have access to it, parents end up talking to me about how grateful, how lucky, how privileged they feel. And in a country that doesn't offer it at a federal level, I understand that rhetoric. But I think that Americans could take a card from this playbook in the Nordic countries and begin to think about some of these family policies as something they have a right to, rather than something they feel privileged to receive from their employers. So that's my 2 cents. I hope that example of paid family leaves helps to clarify.
I think it's excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. And I think on that point, then, when we talk about paid family leave as example, we're not talking about building buildings. We're not talking about building infrastructure. We're talking about directing, transfer payments effectively, which Ben pointed out some challenges that we have in that in a U.S. context, but it's something that is comparatively, this is not about big government. This is about getting folks and making sure that they're productive, as well as from a well-being sense. And one thing that I'd like to point out here that Haldor indicated this before, and Caitlin, after the last time that I saw you, which was November 2019, which as I understand it was 4 decades ago, or it feels like it. The following week, I had the privilege to testify at a congressional hearing at the Small and Medium-Sized Business Committee. And I took the lessons that I drew directly from you, Caitlin, and discussions that we had that day on Nordic parental leaves, and was bringing them to the Small and Medium-Sized Business Committee, because in the Nordics, it has historically been business leaders that have been champions and conservative voices that have been champions of paid family leave and workforce development. They see it in their interest. And in fact, they say, we want to do business That's what we know as business. We don't want to get into all this benefit stuff. And that's what we've kind of gone the road here in the US. And I think you make a very good point about how then when it's left to the markets, it's folks, the haves that effectively get access to this. And here I'd like to just make a point drawing from inspiration from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, for example, when we talk about addressing structural racism in the United States, universal benefits programs are one very important means to do so, where everyone has access. And I don't have any evidence to say there are just as many racists, unfortunately, running around the Nordic countries as they are in the United States. But a difference is that a racist in the United States can prevent you from getting a job just like they can in the Nordic countries. But then by virtue of preventing you from getting a job, that racist individual can prevent you from getting access to healthcare, access to paid leave, saving money for college tuition, et cetera, et cetera. And so the problems exasperate themselves. But with that, I do want to focus on, Holder, I want to come back to you for just a moment here, because in the conversation, in the chats, a very understandable question is, of course, there must be problems in the Nordics. This can't be a utopia. And in fact, if we look, the word utopia literally it comes from no place. There is no place that is a utopia in this world ever. Holder, can you very briefly, though, give us a sense, what are some of the tensions, some of the challenges with respect to the Nordic model as you see it today?
Thank you for allowing me to say something about that, because as I said, I don't think we should talk about the Nordics as utopia or give a too rosy picture. Well, we have one issue is immigration. It's been historically it's been argued that the Nordics are very homogeneous and that we are challenged by this as a new situation. That's not really that. We have a lot of immigrant people in Norway, in the Nordics. In Oslo, it's 25% or something, and it's in Sweden, as you know. But the problem is when you have a strong welfare state, is that people feel that they have earned these benefits from working many years, and then we get immigration, and then people. So you can understand why you have this criticism of immigration, and it's hard to find solutions for this. But what is very important is to have a strong policy for integration, and I think it's starting to work, and that we can deal with it. But certainly this has been an issue, and we have the same as elsewhere with the populist parties and so on. So, but I think we have been able to avoid most of that polarization that follows from it. But so that's one issue, and of course we are supposed to be the leaders in climate change, and as you may know, Norway is is a major exporter of oil, so it's hard, and we also want to be humanitarian superpowers and do peace. We are peace nations, so we meet ourselves in the door sometimes, because we have also been in Afghanistan. We have all these discussions that is elsewhere. But what is the strength so far is that we certainly do not have the same degree of polarization as in the US. So it seems like the political system is able to deal with it, and that we are able to deal with the immigration issues also in the longer run. But it's not easy to have a big welfare state and a lot of immigration. That's for sure.
And Holder, the consensus building culture that you referenced before, which I think is just an evidence also of the strong reverence for democratic practices and and fostering and encouraging and building and strengthening democratic institutions is so fundamentally important. And I think we can all draw inspiration from that. And final, almost lightning round before I turn it over to the ambassador of Iceland to the United States. I'd like to put you all on the spot for one question. And Halldór, I'm going to start with you, then Ben, and then Caitlin, you'll have the final word here. One takeaway that you'd like to leave with the audience. I'd like to put you on the spot for each one succinct takeaway, please, that you'd leave with the audience. Halldór, if I could start with you, please.
Well, I have to say security. I think it's very. I respect a lot the freedom-loving country and the individualism of the US. But I think we can live out our free. We can be much more free people and much more innovative if we have security, like the second level in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So that's why I think it's important to develop a strong healthcare system, a strong insurance in case of events in life that no one can predict, and that you have a job to look forward to, that you have a future to look forward to. I think it has been, and the same thing with bureaucracy. I think you mentioned this thing that. I think the distrust of state, community, and solidarity is not good. I think bureaucracy, a strong welfare system, is important in order to create a more secure and efficient society. I guess that's the word I would use.
Thank you very much. Ben, if I could turn the word to you, please.
I think on top of what Halldór said about security, the United States, we need more resiliency in our workforce. And I think we can look to the Nordic countries for ways to make sure that those at the bottom are receiving the support they need so that they are able to focus on getting back to work and building their own successful, meaningful careers. That's not to say I think that we should, not everything will be directly translatable to the United States, but there are versions of what the Nordic countries have that we can adopt here in order to help people balance family and work, develop meaningful skills, and adopt lifelong learning so that they have very successful careers.
Thank you so very much. Caitlin, you have the final word from the panel, please.
Okay, so my word would be equality. I don't think that the struggles of US working parents are inevitable. And we also don't need to start from scratch in envisioning a more just and equitable, inclusive future here in the US, because we already have models in the Nordics where it's working, right? It's not perfect, it's no utopia, but we have models from which we can draw best practices. And so conversations like these, I think, are incredibly productive in thinking through what it would mean to move us forward to a more just, equitable, and inclusive society.
Well, panelists, on behalf of all of us today, thank you so very much. Excellent offerings. And now it's my privilege to turn the word over to Ambassador Bergdís Eiríksdóttir, Ambassador of Iceland to the United States.
Thank you so much, Robert, Mr. Nordic. I just want to thank all the participants for, this great insights and interesting discussions on the Nordic model. And I must say, I have learned a lot today as well. So if that is anything to go by. And I think, there's a lot of good takeaways from the panelists that can hopefully be an inspiration to our participants online today. And as mentioned by our speakers, the Nordic countries have for a long time promoted inclusive and family-friendly policies, such as many of you have talked about parental leave. And what is very important, the universal affordable quality childcare. And at the same time, we have maintained a highly competitive, productive, and open market economies. And I think that is an important takeaway, I think, for our US audiences. So In our experience, an inclusive, a smart and gender equal economic policies are not just about supporting individuals and families, it's good economics. And prone to spur economic growth, labor force participation, productivity, resilience, happiness, and benefit all of society. And as I think someone mentioned that, I don't think that it is a coincidence that all the Nordic countries score very high on the happiness scale globally. And then I just want to, after living for a few years here in the US, I mean, long working hours do not automatically translate into high productivity. We are now experimenting in Iceland on shortening the work week. And first of all, the workers have been reported to have found greater happiness, and there has been no loss in productivity. And as my Danish colleague Lone touched upon in the beginning, the business case for gender equality when it comes to economic policy is strong and close to the hearts of us in the Nordic countries. And Caitlin mentioned equality. I mean, gender equality brings several economic as well as social benefits. And the more gender equal the societies are, they tend to be happier, healthier, more trusting, and have more prosperous economies. And Halldór referred to trust as the Nordic gold. And maybe the takeaways here, if you throw out words, it would be universalism, trust, security, and efficiency. I mean, this would kind of sum up what we've been discussing here today. And I also want to, as I said, it's been so interesting to listen to the panelists. And I just wanted maybe to say in the end that I do hope that our US friends have found inspirations in this talk. And then I just want to say to Dr. Collins or Caitlin, I'm really looking forward to the sequence of making motherhood work, and that is making fatherhood work. So thank you very much for this.